Hello there, happy Friday. I hope you're all doing well. I'd like to kick off the conversation that we're going to have today about self medication. Before we get started, though, I'll introduce myself. My name is Makoto. This is the sign that I use for my name. Let me give a visual description. I'm an Asian man with short hair. I'm currently wearing a gray t shirt with an American flag across the front. Behind me on my right, you can see a white door, along with the white door on my left with some blinds, and directly behind me, an abstract painting. You can also see some brown furniture in the background. How about yourself? Hi there. My name is Misty. Um, Behind me, you can see a gray wall, and in the very corner, you can see a black square framed piece of art on the wall. I'm wearing a light pink blouse. I have clear glasses because I can't read. I have blonde hair. I'm wearing a watch, and my arms have tattoos on them. Thanks very much for your time today. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Great. Well, we're here to talk about what self-medication is. I hope you all can learn something from this webinar. So, can you tell us a little bit about addiction, what that looks like? Can you explain that concept? Yeah, of course. I think one of the most important questions is how you know that you might have an addiction. And you could be at any number of phases in addiction, whether you're in control or out of control, which would depend on your life situation. In college, or when you're young, as either a child or a young adult, you might want to experiment with different things. You learn about marijuana and be curious about its effects. The same is true with alcohol. Maybe your friend has started talking about these substances and you've dabbled in them. That's step one. Step two is social use. So, for example, smoking a cigarette once in a while, drinking once in a while. You're in a stage in which you can control your use. This third stage is one in which use becomes a habit. So it may be that you're drinking every day, or that you're drinking or smoking on the weekends. It's a point in time in which you're using habitually. The fourth stage is really when drugs take over your mind and you start to think about things like needing money in order to buy substances. That's a point in which you have a relationship with these substances, or where substances affect your personal relationships. So these phases are important to keep in mind as we go along today. Thanks very much for that. I thought about my experience in college when you were explaining that just now. And, I think I recognize that you're quite right. Some of the behaviors that you described were ones that I remember exhibiting, like going to parties on the weekends and drinking with friends. Looking back, I have to wonder, did I really enjoy that? Was that something that I did for myself, or did I do it for others? I remember right before I started drinking, I was nervous and shy, and I felt like I didn't know how to socialize. And when I used alcohol, I went into a state where I could talk a little more. And so I had to think about how it was that these substances changed my behavior, be it wine, alcohol, other drugs, changed my behavior from one of being anxious to one of being calm. And these changes in behavior were not ones that I really analyzed until I got to my point in life now. So, can you talk a little bit more about medication, self-medication, and what that means? Sure. I'm going to apply that to my own experience if I can. When I was in college, that was a time when I first learned about mental health and my own mental health. And it was a time in which I didn't really understand the importance of taking care of myself. I mentioned before that in college, many people become curious about the effects of substances. And for me, for myself, when I experimented with marijuana and took a hit off a bong, it actually caused my anxiety to get a lot worse. And I remember my friends turning to me and asking, what happened? It turned out that there was a mixture of substances. There were some mushrooms in there as well. But looking back at that point in time, the anxiety that I experienced from that experience with the bong was just something that hit me one time. But because of the experience, I had issues with panic attacks, not related to drug use, but in class, I would have to go to the bathroom and I would find myself crying and saying, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die. So I went to get a psychological evaluation. And it was at that time that I realized that, um, I had been refusing medication in my 20s, and I can talk about that more a little bit later. But I thought self-medication in terms of going out and partying and having a good time was good, but that's not always true. Yeah, and I think that that word is one that not a lot of people completely understand. And it's not something that people have a name for sometimes. They may think that it's just being social. And on the outside, there's nothing wrong with it. But really, the motivation for many people is one that they don't realize. It's not just about getting to know people, but it's about using a substance to make oneself feel better. And oftentimes it doesn't work, right? We know that we can end up hungover, we can forget what it is that we said the night before, we can feel guilty or embarrassed about what may have happened. And so self medication, depending on the substance, can help someone feel better in the moment. But the effects on the body can be much longer lasting in terms of producing anxiety or depression or something that someone can't control. So I think we need to recognize that the temporary effects of self medication can be one way, but the long term effects can be quite the opposite way. Specifically, the short term effects can feel positive, but the long term effects can be much more negative in terms of depression. We also have to think about the brain balance and the imbalance that can happen when someone self medicates. And we see this specifically when someone reduces their substance use and they achieve a state of much more balance in their life. So, can you talk a little bit more about medication in terms of medical practice and how that may actually be beneficial? Yeah, I hated the feeling of not being able to control my life, of not being, of crying all the time or being depressed all the time, not being happy. I was screaming for help, And, I have to preface this by saying that my family has a long history of mental illness, PTSD, depression, trauma, and anxiety. But it wasn't something that was talked about within the context of my family. There was no communication about that among generations. And excuse my language, but I had to, what the fuck is going on here? I had to deal with it and find out for myself. So the psychiatrist gave me Prozac at one point, and I hated it. I felt like I was in a cloud, like I was emotionless, like I wasn't moving and the world was kind of moving around me. I felt completely not like myself. So I quit that cold turkey, and I was so afraid of trying something else because I didn't want to feel that way anymore. I eventually tried Zoloft, and that seemed to work a lot better for me. Now, it's not just medication, but exercise, diet. For myself, I became a vegetarian. All of these things can contribute to mental well-being. That's interesting that you say that. I was just the opposite. I was first given Zoloft and it didn't work. I had diarrhea and headaches. And I had the same reaction that, if one medication didn't work for me, then others weren't either. But it took some time for me to start processing what had happened and what I wanted, to think about how medication might be good for me and to keep an open mind in the process of finding out what it is that would help me control my mental health. Because mental health is everything. It's how we take care of ourselves, but it also affects the other parts of our life. And if it's not in order, those other parts of our life can really go off the rails. So I asked my doctor for another medication. I ended up getting Lexapro, and I didn't have those same side effects. I did feel a little itchy, a little rushed in some things sometimes. And I had to work with my doctor in order to figure out what it is that was an okay side effect that I could live with, or ones that I, needed to adjust. And so we adjust the dosage. And it took about 2 or 3 months for me to get up to 20 milligrams as a dosage on that. It took me a while also to recognize whether or not it was working. And I remember my doctor asking me if it worked, you know, over the course of a month or two. And I didn't really see it, but when I asked my friends and family, they could see that I was much more focused, that I had made some improvements, that I was much more socially involved and enjoying myself. So, we do have to remember that no pill is going to be magic. This is always a learning experience in terms of figuring out what works best for you, getting the right amount of sleep, exercise, eating the right things, having a support system with friends and family, and really remembering that medication only exists within this holistic approach of health. So for those of you who might be a little resistant to using medication, remember that this is just one way to control mood. Yep, yeah, you really hit that on the nail. So when we talk about mental health and physical health, we have to remember that they have a relationship to each other. And we can't just focus on one or the other, but we have to focus on both in parallel. What do you think about that? Well, if I could ask you to hold on to that question for just a second, and if I could come back to something you were just talking about, um, which was the question of judging your own improvement in mood or demeanor. I think an important question is to wonder how you react to things and if that has changed. I remember thinking, this medicine is bullshit. It's not actually going to work. But having some patience in that process is going to allow you to wait for the results and to see if you can feel them. Now, coming back to the question that you had asked me about mental health and addiction, I don't like that specific sign that many people use, so I'll fingerspell it. Chemical dependency, yeah, that's another way to describe it. So there is a lot of overlap. People with mental illness sometimes confuse themselves with using drugs, thinking that drugs will help them feel better, but typically it doesn't. It will actually make the situation worse. Remember that alcohol is a downer. So if you're experiencing depression, it can actually make those symptoms worse. I'm using alcohol as an example here, but if you go out and drink and have a good time, and you end up drinking quite a lot, you may feel the side effects of that, right? Oh God, I feel like shit. I've got a headache. Eventually, your feeling will come back. But the use of medication is really meant to get you to an equilibrium so that you're not on this cycle of up and down. Now, mixing these things is not going to make these better, right? You shouldn't have both medication and drugs. It's not going to work. You need to, I have to tell people this because they think, and I have to tell myself that too, right? If I drink wine, and I do once in a while, I have to remember that that might counteract the effects of the medication. So I have to do so in moderation. We have to think about treating both and about the effects of how it is that we treat ourselves. In therapy, we often can work on both. You suggested that you can go to addiction or substance dependency counseling. You can also go to mental health counseling. I specialize in chemical dependencies um, in my work, so you might want to pursue different avenues. Yeah, I think that's right. In particular, when we talk about medication and mental health, it's important that we use a perspective about medication management in general. And think about our attitudes about using medication. There are some negative attitudes out there. We have to remember that the way that these medications work require a lot of time. They require a lot of courage and patience in order to maintain our own well-being and an investment in our health. This is not simply you sitting down in front of a doctor and asking for a pill and taking it one time and your symptoms going away. Instead, this is something that you're going to have to invest some time into to figure out what works for you, how you're working on your own life skills, coping skills, support system, and then to talk about how it is that you can support others who may not be comfortable expressing how it is that they're feeling or what their mental health situation is. Stigma in our society is still really strong. And you have to think about ways that you can be a support to other people. Oh yeah, for sure. I see the word stigma every day, right? And people look down on our work every day. I've seen people act like the work that I do is unimportant or it's not helping anyone. And I have to be like, yeah, it is. But for so many, it it's really a lifeline. I mentioned my family situation, and stigma can be felt in a lot of situations. It can be whatever taboo someone puts on you, whether it's in the home environment or in your friends, to say, oh, that's not for us. We're better than that. We're rich. We have resources. We have money. And so, we're better than medication. We're better than mental illness. But that's not, I mean, the bottom line is the brain has chemicals in it, and sometimes they can be in imbalance. Now, even more so in the deaf and hard of hearing community, we see a lot of stigma, right? We see a lot of gossip, and that's something that we need to stop. We need to be respectful of each other, to keep in confidence what people tell us, and to support each other so that we can help each other get sober, that they can be comfortable expressing themselves to us, and that we can be a place that they can come to. When stigma exists in our communities, these negative mindsets, those feelings, like I explained in my family, oh gosh, why are you spending time and money on that? Get internalized and just make it worse because we ignore the need that's there. We turn to other substances and we never actually address the issues that are there. We say, no one's pitying me, no one's supporting me, and we end up drowning in our own issues. Yeah, stigma is really, really tough. It's very complex. Yeah, and it hurts our community spirit. I mean, really, we get no benefit from stigma, right? We're only serving to block out people within our community and to make them hide from the internal struggles that they may have. We all need to be vulnerable with each other, and we need to support people in their vulnerability and say, that's okay. It took me a while for me to become honest with myself and to admit the issues that I had. In Asian culture in particular, that's another layer to my story, and not wanting to talk about the way that I felt and just sweep everything under the rug. But it became worse, and that didn't help me at all. But by the time I was ready to talk about who I was and how I felt, the mental health issues I was experiencing, I came to a place where I could see how my behavior was affected by my lack of honesty. And it was finally in finding someone like me in our community and not feeling alone anymore that I could then turn to others and encourage them with my story. Can I say something to that? Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead. So you mentioned Asian culture and how there's this maybe tendency to be um, be very tough. So that's similar to my culture, which is a military brat. I grew up on military bases with my parents. My grandfathers, generations back, taught me to be tough. They said you got to have a tough exterior. And so that meant that I once again held everything inside. And vulnerability was treated as a weakness. Crying was treated as a weakness. And that was something that was drilled into me from very young. when I got to college and I was homesick, I was having all of these emotions like, this doesn't feel right. And I didn't know how to react to those emotions. And that's really when I started drinking. Yeah, and once again, it's always so good to find people who can remind me that I'm not the only person experiencing this and that there are other stories out there like mine that need to be told. I think it's beautiful that we can find people in our community who are struggling with different things and we can help them by telling our stories. And their stories can help us break down some of the barriers that we are experiencing, some of the stigma that we've experienced, in order for that to become a positive thing. Yeah, we need to look at each other as peers, as equals, rather than looking down on others. We need compassion. We need to support each other. And I know that when I'm in community with you, you trust me, and then I can trust you. And that allows us to be in community. That then makes stigma unimportant, right? Because we want to care for each other. That doesn't mean that we're not blunt anymore, that we're not telling people like it is, but we're avoiding bullying. We're avoiding that stigma, that negative perception of how someone is acting. We need to remember that patience is really important and that we can be naive about someone else's experience, but that we need to be apologetic if we make a mistake and keep an open mind. Yeah, that's right. We need to be willing to talk to others, to listen to their stories. And whatever story you have, please tell it. Please share it with us and with others. You can make a big difference in other people's lives by doing just that. So please follow our organization on Facebook, Instagram, and other social media accounts. We're looking forward to learning more about your stories in the future. I also hope that someone will put our contact information here. Um, and just keep in mind that if you do reach out to us, that is confidential because we realize how our community can be very tight knit. Yes, we want to make more relationships with you and continue on in health. Yep, be your best story because you'll feel your best. Trust me. When you are vulnerable, you're actually being brave. I have to commend my co-presenter here to be brave and to accept accept telling your story. Thank you all so much for watching us. We'll see you later.